welcome students, teachers, anybody else interested in the 4B's conversation on Constitution in American life. Tonight we're going to be talking about Thomas Hobbes and kind of his influence on American thought, but also on his views of the human condition and the challenges to modern society. Here for those We the People students, this is Unit 6, Question 1 for the National We the People competition, but it's one of those really, really broad questions that there's no way in HE double toothpicks that you can answer in 4 minutes with any kind of substance. Hopefully tonight we'll be able to give you maybe some angles on that. With us tonight is a special guest. We have Professor Neil Richmond. He has a master's in philosophy. I believe that is predominantly in political theory, but I could be wrong about that. He's also got a law degree and another master's. What is that other master's in?
It's an LLM in tax policy.
Yes, and so he will be about he'll be about 62 when he pays off all his student loans. There for all of those,
If I'm lucky.
If you're lucky there. So, but he is one of our primary scholars we use in the state of California for Unit 1. I know he's met with a number of groups this year alone, and so not only does he have the knowledge, but he has the passion. Obviously we are related to each other, and so when he gets going on this stuff, you just don't want to stand on his way. I actually went back and tried to read this weekend Leviathan by they just don't use the same English words that we do in the 21st century. So it was okay. See, all right, Cece's got his copy there, but and I'm assuming Professor Richmond, that you have looked at the question.
I have, yeah, done some thinking about it, took down some notes.
All right, so I'm curious, do you accept, just looking at Hobbes?
No, I don't. I think I already know your first question, and the answer is no, but go ahead.
Well, do you accept the premise of Hobbes? My general sense is Hobbes has a pessimistic view of the human condition, human nature, or whatever. Do you kind of accept that premise, or do you not even accept the premise of my question?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, that Hobbes does have, he has a very specific, and pessimistic, maybe, more, he considers himself a mechanistic realist, right? So he doesn't think he's being pessimistic. He thinks he's really truthfully describing, in a sort of proto-scientific way, how humans behave under all of the possible conditions of their existence, right? And he's really sort of trying to, obviously this precedes by 4 centuries the advent of Bayesianism and game theory and actual methodical empirical analysis of human behavior, but he's trying that same kind of project, or at least trying to couch what had before that been metaphysically or ontologically couched questions into empirically couched questions, right? How do people behave? Well, we could talk about teleologies, right, and ends, and we could talk about forms or Neoplatonic versions of forms, and we can talk about the fall of man and sin. And he's, very much like Machiavelli is doing a little bit before him, he's not trying to attach any significance to metaphysical appeals to essence. He's instead simply trying to say, look, if we look at history and we look at how people behave now in civilization, we can draw certain conclusions abductively about how they ought to have, or perhaps did in fact behave before civilization. So I don't think that project in of itself is a bad one, especially given the time that he's writing and the materials and the tools that he has, right? Bacon had literally just been writing a few centuries before that. You don't have substantive development of the scientific methodology before that. So he's doing the best that he can. I think he proceeds from false premises in the sense that his premise is a clear premise. And if it were true, I think his argument might be sound, but his premise isn't true, right? So
for the sake of the students, what do you see as its premise?
Well, one is, I mean, there's a denial of a moral nature to human beings, right? There's no moral directionality. There isn't this concept that the arc of history moves towards justice or any idea like that. That there's a kind of developmental flow, right? The same way that Hegel and others after Kant, even into the 18th and 19th century, might believe that there's not quite a teleology in the Aristotelian sense towards rationality or towards eudaimonia, right? Or eudaimonia, sort of moderate flourishing of the human creature. Instead, it's an atomistic. Thinking about it in terms of, simplify it. A pool ball, when struck in a particular way, will move in a particular direction, and that's determinable by the state of the pool ball, the state of the object that strikes it, and the environment in which the pool ball is moving. And so that's what we mean by mechanism, that we can explain the behaviors and we can explain the outcomes of particular organizations of human beings merely by understanding their starting states and by understanding the different forces that act upon human beings. And can make predictions about human behavior in that way without needing to appeal to internal mental states or the moral status of man as fallen or hidden elements of humanity, right? Everything is observable and determinable in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does to me. So kind of moving forward, a lot of textbooks, frame this 17th century as a debate, or there is a debate, not necessarily an actual one, between the Hobbesian view and the Lockean view. All right, and again, whether that to an individual who studied it as deeply as you have, makes sense. That seems to be the simple framework that a lot of texts present there. And just looking at that, it seems to me that if we were to look at that debate between Locke and Hobbes, that in the 21st century, the Hobbesian view is definitely winning that bet. You agree with that or not?
Well, that's a really loaded question, so I'll try to kind of deflate that down. Because a lot happens, right, between the 17th century and the 20th century as far as the development of psychology and the development of sociology and the development of anthropology and archaeology and understanding the actual, or at least as best we can, understanding the pre-civilization existence of the human animal or human beings. I mean, to contrast the Lockean versus Hobbesian view, I guess, Locke is possibly more accurate in the sense that he doesn't ever really appeal to the idea of human beings ever being solitary or without social structure, right? Locke doesn't make that argument. He merely makes the argument that you don't have formal legal organizing schemas for society, and that's the state of nature, right? It's the absence of those formal legal contract sort of oriented organizing schemas. Whereas Hobbes's view is much more sort of a every man for himself, kind of like a Thunderdome version of humanity, which we know, or at least we know as best as one can know 50,000 years after the fact, that probably never was the case, right? Human beings, if you take an evolutionary perspective, human beings never existed in anything less than small collections of familial units and related units. And there's never any kind of human social grouping that's less complex than that. And so when we're talking about who gets the anthropological picture of what human existence pre-civilization, pre-law is, I mean, Locke is probably closer to the truth. I think Locke gets it wrong in his interpretation of what drives the organization towards law being primarily property, but they both hone in, I think, on a good aspect of trying to answer this question, which is, what are the driving motivations behind a pre-state group of human beings, whatever the natural organizing schema might be, into the known structures of legal organization that we have in the early modern era and after that. So to say that Hobbes is winning out, I guess I would want to ask, like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean in the sense that we take a behaviorist, sort of empiricist approach to studying human behavior, or?
Well, and again, it's
well, I would ask, because I think Dave's onto something here. I wonder whether, because I know they both reach different conclusions about organizational schemes. Hobbes more of a Leviathan, strong, powerful ruler, and Locke's more comfortable with a dispersed
Night watchman, right?
Yeah, a dispersed, maybe even a legislative entity. But I wonder whether we are Hobbesian in the sense that we want a strong Leviathan to deal with crap. And so we're Hobbesian, and we don't want the deliberative body of legislatures to deal with crisis. So I wonder whether, Dave, outcomes from these two thinkers is what people are thinking more about than pre-social contract. That's kind of how I hear your question a little bit. Is that where you were headed or not?
Well, yeah, it is. And again, I'm going to take it to the simplest form. One, and especially to what our high school students, for the most part, are dealing with, is Hobbes is seen as an advocate for authoritarianism or absolutism. He has a very cynical, if that's the right word, view of human nature on an individualistic level.
Well, Calvinists call that realism.
All right, I understand. I understand that these, what we want to call it, but and Locke doesn't have as nearly as dark of a view of human nature.
Yeah.
And Hobbes, and this is where trying to read today, I can't tell if Hobbes. At some points, Hobbes says you can reject the Leviathan. You can resist the Leviathan if the Leviathan is going to ask you to sacrifice your life, because the whole purpose of the social contract and forming this social organization is our fear of death, and our fear that death will come about because of this constant state of war. But Locke clearly talks about this implicit right to revolution if the government is not abiding by the social contract there. So Tim, absolutely is, and to me, it's been the ongoing struggle since, maybe the 18th century, if the late 17th century, between this absolutist model, all right, and this, and whether we want to call it Republican model or, more rights-based model there under Locke, that in our time and right now specifically, we see more and more countries, possibly based out of this populist notion of fear, turning to more authoritarian systems of government. So that's kind of where I was headed there, and you don't see a lot of, especially what we might call emerging nations or what used to be colonial, you don't see them pushing towards a more of a Lockean or a individual liberty based society. So so that's the question. Is it seems to me that historically, the human experience is moving more towards, again, authoritarian or more absolutist forms of government.
I think you may be overstating a teensy bit Locke's, how much he's basing it on, like individual rights and representative government. He's all about property. And the types of people that are going to be represented with Locke are the elites. So I mean, and I see that same dynamic happening today in both developing and developed countries. Like someone was asking yesterday, who are the laws written for? This is something to do with the pandemic, right? Most laws in the United States are written for the middle and upper class. They're not written for lower income folks. So this notion of protecting private property, I think, is a legacy of Locke's that we're still with, as well as the legacy of Hobbes that you mentioned as well. I just don't think it's as clear cut as you said it.
And I would add on too, David, with your supposition about emerging countries now. I think the pendulum swings, right? I think that what we see perhaps post-Soviet collapse in Eastern Europe, you see people tending towards a more Lockean view, but now the pendulum is swinging back perhaps a different way. So I think depending on the situation and circumstance and the locality, it depends. I guess it depends. So I don't necessarily see a Hobbesian view winning out over a Lockean view.
Yeah.
Mike, I would ask you about more African nations that, I mean, are they still, you see them trending Lockean or Hobbesian?
That's a tricky question.
Can I even word that question that way? Is that a stupid question?
I think there's a strain in a lot of a lot of African cultures have a strain of what we might think of as Rousseau more than a Hobbes or a Locke. And for me, this is where, like, historically, as Neil already said, we know from evolutionary biologists, from neuroscientists, we all started living together. Like, we were all in a collective. Aristotle said it, right? Thousands of years ago, that we're social beings. Hobbes to me he was pretty successful of changing what we argue about and changing our point of reference about who we are as humans. I mean, he succeeded in that pretty well. And as Neil said, I don't buy maybe Dave said it as well, I don't buy the premise of where Hobbes starts with his argument. So it's hard for me then to take the rest of him seriously. He's arguing for himself to get a good job in what's going to become a state system. We just had the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. It's been an English Civil War. He wants a state. He wants a state system. And he's just trying to get himself a way to get in that.
Oh, man, come on. You just can't deconstruct it totally, Mike.
Totally in that historical moment.
Well, but wasn't he like, wasn't he like kind of employed by the Cavendish family? I mean, wasn't he hired as kind of like a tutor for the kid? And he was associated with that same family that had for almost 70 years. So I don't think he was worried about where his next meal was coming from, was he?
Well, he was exiled, right? After publishing Leviathan, exiled, never returned. So, I mean, I think he was, anyway, I'll let the historians maybe comment on that.
Well, I want to ask.
I tend to agree with Mike there. That it was a very
I want to ask Neil a question. It's been years since I read Hobbes, but I'll never forget the first chapter is this whole chapter on atoms smashing into each other. And
mechanistic materialism.
I got that after I got through the first couple chapters. But at the time, I'm like, what the heck? I thought I was reading a political treatise, and he starts with the vibrancy of atoms smashing into each other. And I think, it makes sense when he goes on to describe how all the atoms in a state of nature and humans smash into each other. But I mean, isn't that Darwinian? I guess that's my question. Is this like Darwinianism that the whole cosmos is constant rattle and hum and smashing into each, and it's survival of the whatever, it's survival of the atoms. It seems Darwinian to me.
I mean, I don't really know what you mean by Darwinian. Darwinianism is usually highlighted by a concept of fitness, which would have to do with the structure.
Struggle,
right?
I guess.
Well,
struggle.
I mean, I'm hesitant to characterize Darwin that way, other than in his particular writings in the 19th century, rather than sort of how he is theoretically interpreted in the actual praxis of evolutionary biology. But to say that there are themes there, that are similar, I think is true, in the sense that we needn't, and I alluded to this before, just that we needn't appeal to any kind of spiritual essence or essentialist ontology to explain human behavior or to arrive at an answer to the question of what is a just government. We can do so through observing the way that humans behave when they struggle, right? When they run into impediments and try to overcome them. And I mean, in the sense that there is a essential biological drive to survive and to carry on that survival through further generations, I mean, that's built in part to what Hobbes arguing. So there are connections there between Hobbes and Darwin. Certainly, I mean, Darwin read Hobbes, Darwin commented on Hobbes in his own writings, right? So not in a positive way, but in a way of sort of pointing to Hobbes and other writers writing in the mechanistic materialist tradition, which is not a long tradition at all, but one that still survived into the 18th century and the 19th century, that they had the right idea that we shouldn't be appealing to supernatural forces to explain why, civilizations rise and fall, or why one person is successful or another. We should be appealing to facts, and then the emergent properties of the elements, right, of the environment that we're working in. Both the external environment acting on the individual and the individual acting on the external environment. One thing I want to there's a dichotomy here that I don't like very much, right? Which is this idea that we're either in Locke land or we're in Hobbes land, as if they, and Mike, I appreciate sort of bringing up Rousseau. I would hope that we carry that on to Marx and Fichte and Hegel and all the others who have a very different idea of how societies organize, how civilizations organize, and how justice might come along. But I to answer the original question, I suppose going all the way back a few minutes ago, I think I agree that it seems to be true that when human beings face collective calamity or the potential for collective calamity or a threat that is perceived to be existential, they do tend to look for somebody to save them. And that's not everybody. And it seems to be cultural as much as it is maybe biological or essentially driven from human nature, if we want to talk about it that way. But there does seem to be a tendency to say, hey, I'm an individual, I can't save myself from the tsunami or the climate change or the polar vortex or the global thermonuclear war. I need a Leviathan of some kind to protect me. But there's also other strains, mostly within subcultures and subgroups, at least within the United States, that don't have a lot of political power, but certainly have a lot of social presence that would deny that and would say, actually, we need the opposite of that. We need granular, on the ground, grassroots, everybody pulling everything up in order to do it. And we need the absence of a Leviathan. We need to lose all authority, right, in order to overcome these problems, because they are problems that are caused by individuals abdicating their autonomy, abdicating their responsibility to each other, to the world, to their society, in favor of authority and power and wealth to make the decisions and guide us and put the guardrails down and tell us what tracks we need to be on. And that has led us to this point. And this point ain't so great, so we need to break it all down. So there's that. I just want to make sure that that's here in the conversation, right? That there is an anarchist sort of strain or a stateless strain in this thinking that says we don't need a Leviathan and we don't need representatives. We need each one of us to be equally responsible, which is obviously much harder than Locke or Hobbes's view, and a view that I don't think Locke or Hobbes could have come to in their time, because the democratization of education and the general increase in the availability of resources for all people, and not to say that that's something that's a completed process, but more people are educated, more people are capable of engaging in the kind of global critical thought and global critical communication than they ever have been before. So there's a third way. in that we don't need a state, we need a unified people.
So I want to dig down to the kind of the question, the main question there. And when I first read this, I thought about you, Professor Moore, because it seems to imply, one, that Hobbes' view of the human condition is accurate or acceptable, however we want to frame that, that life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, but that the human condition has changed over time. One might imply progress there, that man has progressed over time, and through that progress, it has changed our entire view of what we expect of government. So I'm curious, Professor Moore, what you think about that, and do you read it the same? Do you read that question the same way?
Yeah, I do read the question the same way. I'd like to start out. I'd like to start out by saying that both Locke and Hobbes were largely, especially Hobbes, during ratification, he's mentioned like 4 or 5 times, and we have 35 volumes of stuff on ratification, and he's not even a footnote. In fact, when I looked at this today, he's mentioned in the Virginia, I think it's the Virginia ratification debates, and I even forget who the speaker was, but the speaker essentially said, the authors of Leviathan, the author of Oceana, the author of Utopia, all these are metaphysical word games, and the history has proven these people to be largely irrelevant. Now they've seen, so both Locke and Hobbes are not, I mean, Locke is cited maybe 12, 15 times throughout the ratification debates, Hobbes hardly any. So I guess my point is that in a large sense, these politicians have precious little patience, maybe would be the right word, to tap into any philosophical tradition as they go about ratifying the Constitution. They're concerned about more on the ground issues than they are the high and lofty. But I think Hobbes does represent a real problem if you want to believe in human progress. I think his assumptions of the way the cosmos works is pretty, to Neil's point, mechanistic. And I mean, his state of nature is war. I mean, Locke is a little more generous. There's a little more reasonableness in the state of nature, I think, as I read Locke anyway, than I do Hobbes. But I think some of the folks at the founding would have recoiled at such a bleak picture of human nature that Hobbes creates, because that puts their efforts on question as to whether they're exercising with any degree of nobility. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question directly, David, or not.
Mike?
Yeah, I want to question, and yeah, Tim and Chris, Neil. So, okay, that's interesting that they were barely mentioned, but what I see these two, Locke and Hobbes, giving us is social contract theory. And when I think about the whole writing of the Constitution and ratification process, that's exactly what the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are arguing about, is how many rights are we willing to give up to this federal government? So I'm wondering, is it possible they're mentioned so little just because that normative way to see the creation of a government is so the water they're swimming in? Because social contract theory, that is part of our founding, or am I completely missing my history lesson on that?
Or it's British common law that they're talking about more so than social contracting.
Right, and I don't disagree with that, Tim, but at the same time, I mean, there's a difference between a phenomena existing descriptively and it being the case that, and it being systematized and categorized and becoming a framework for thinking about novel problems, which is, I think I agree with Mike, that whether they were cited or not, they are approaching the construction of a state from a formal methodological approach that maybe it was not
right.
novel, but certainly is emergent from the, so yes, British common law, absolutely, but that's also influencing the writings of the writers who they're appealing to either directly or
Right.
indirectly. I'll also point out that Machiavelli is not cited anywhere, and yet it's, his ideas pop up all over the place in the justifications for where the state ought to take power, even if it's not his specific writings, and other writers as well. So there may have been a little bit of academic bad faith there on the part of some of the framers wanting to take older ideas for themselves, maybe Madison and Paine in particular. So, sorry, I've lost your original question, Dave, but I think that adopting a view on human nature that should be crystallized, hypostasized, right, into a governing document. I don't think a lot of the framers would disagree with that, but I think it's a fundamental flaw, because human nature, if we can call it that, is a very deflationary concept, right? I mean, we have a deflationary concept now of human nature. What is human nature? Well, it can be boiled down to some very, very, very basic biological urges, prosociality, fecundity, etc. But otherwise, are humans naturally selfish or altruistic? Well, it depends. Are humans naturally violent or peaceful? Well, it depends. So I don't think that there's I don't think that there's any good in building a political philosophy based on a set essence to humanity, because there isn't one other than a very, very basic essence shared with most other higher mammals.
Well, here's my struggle, and maybe this bleeds into the first sub question, is this idea, or the idea that this human condition somehow frames our expectations of government. And I'm probably too formulaic for you, Neil, but to me it's okay. If indeed we are more Hobbesian in our existence, we're going to have greater expectations of government authority to protect us from ourselves. And but if we're not, if again in this paradigm that we're playing around with, if we're more Lockean, that is, Locke's general sense is, most people, aren't bad people. They're not, absolutely selfish, that they have some virtue. There is a small group of Hobbesian miscreants or whatever that you got to deal with. So I mean, for the students, I'm trying to figure out what is the formula, what's the relationship between the human condition and expectations of government, and that's to all of you. How do you read that question, and how would you approach that question? Is there a formulaic kind of approach to this, that if conditions are set in this way, this is our expectation of government?
I'm going to jump in because something Neil had said earlier, I was trying to think of something, I was trying to fish around in a book here. So, but think about these two ideas. Think about 9/11 and then the pandemic. And it seems to me after 9/11 and the passage of the Patriot Act that gave sweeping power to the government to keep us safe, to channel Hobbes because we feared that violent death at the hands of another, we're willing to give the government power and to come in and save us. But yet during the pandemic, which has killed more people than World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined in just about a year, we have a large swath of our population that doesn't want that government power. And I don't know where that fits into our discussion of Hobbesian versus Lockean.
So I think this is a good tie-in, because one of the things that I got thinking about with this question is, I mean, you're absolutely right, but it's about perception, right? It's about the perceived threat and how the threat is communicated, not just on an individual level, not just my understanding, but the community understanding, the social understanding of the threat. And 9/11 was uniformly treated as a threat to the nation. And there was a unifying national identity sort of brought to bear in that perception that still held. And so, and I think the pandemic is different because the 20 years difference between that event and this has seen a development and of siloed media sources, epistemic balkanization, where you are able to sit on your island and have your truth. Concept that is still completely absurd to my hearing, the idea of an individual truth. But yeah, and so with that, I think we answer Dave's question, which is that yes, the change in human condition, namely the change in human epistemic conditions, your conditions of knowing and believing about the world and perceiving the world, those conditions absolutely do change what people perceive to be the role of government and their relationship with the state. But those views are still ultimately going to be informed by an underlying normativity that has to do with, what do I believe ought to be the case with, between me and what rights do I think I actually have? What responsibilities do I honestly believe in here in me rather than to the state? And then it's a negotiation between what I think is the ideal versus what I think the world actually provides the possibility for in this moment. And some people are closer to the idealistic view, and some people are closer to sort of having a very deflated idea of what that norm is, what that ought, and the answer to that ought question is, and much more in tune with, well, pragmatically short term right now, this is what I need, right? And I think that helps kind of describe a lot of the strata that we have in US society and the response to the pandemic, right? A lot of folks see themselves as not necessarily having a lot of responsibility for, what is happening, and therefore that responsibility has to go to the state, because who else could have responsibility for it? Because the state of things that, their relationship to events in the world is systemically determined rather than determined by their own decisions or their own behavior. And then likewise, you have other folks who don't see it that way, who see the systems as being the kind of background to the stage that they can knock over the set piece if they need to. And so they view themselves as, you view the locus of political power and the locus of economic power and the locus of the ability to act at the individual rather than at the systemic level. And I know that was a lot of stuff, but basically I'm saying, I think you're right, Chris, to pick that out, because I think the way that people perceive the world and the differences in how people gain knowledge about the world in the last 20 years has led to a new type, maybe not new, right? It's not novel, but folks were writing about this in the mid 20th century and earlier, but the world that you know is the world that you form opinions about, and being able to control the world that people know is the ability to control their opinions about this, their relationship with them, between the individual and government.
Well, so if the human condition has gotten better, how does that form our expectation of government? Let's just start with that assumption. The human condition has gotten better. Life expectancy, advances in medical science, advances in material possessions, yada, yada, yada. Does that then lead us to want less government or more government?
Don't use life expectancy in the United States.
I knew you were going to say that.
Well, if you're going to use that as a barometer, that's maybe not a good barometer right now.
Well, right now it's possibly a blip too, in the middle of a pandemic there, but and we'll have to see. But I'm not just talking about I would assume
Still have
that was Chris channeling his inner Hobbes there.
Well,
I don't know that the human condition. I don't know that when you say the human condition has gotten better, I don't know that it has. I don't know that it has. I mean, by the way, I hate to say this, but God, I've come around to Tim's way of thinking about progress.
Well, and I maybe have moderated myself a little bit too, Chris. So we might be passing each other at some point. But I wonder if whether, and maybe Mike can address this, because this is maybe a political science question. Wasn't that kind of David? David's asking about human progress and our changing expectations of government. Wasn't that kind of Rawls, that, you know, we could use this enlightened liberalism to have more equitable outcomes? I mean, there seems to be a great optimism about government, and doesn't that optimism kind of assume human more understanding or human progress when he wrote that book, or not? Or maybe Neil or Chris, I don't, when you asked that question, David, it made me think of, was Rawls in that train of believing in progress, that government could do positive outcomes towards justice?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think Rawls would agree that government can have a role if under the right conditions in bringing about a more just.
But not a Leviathan role, right?
No.
Okay.
And for the reason that the mere exercise of authority in that way, right, an absolute authority, is autonomy depleting, and autonomy being the utmost value of justice, right? You achieve justice when everybody is able to act autonomously, and in so doing, bring about a better state of the world than they would have had they acted through coercion or acted under force, right? It's the idea that you cultivate a society and a culture that makes good decisions. You don't need the state to tell you to do the right thing, because you've cultivated, the idea being, you can either get to the right equitable outcome by forcing people to do that thing, and you might get the right utility out of that outcome, but you will have not gotten the enriching autonomy of the individuals, right? The individual will be non-autonomous, and so therefore you're always in a worse off state than if everybody had come and autonomously, using transparency and full knowledge of all of the potential outcomes, but no knowledge of our possible beginning states in the actual government, that we would make decisions to create systems that would put guardrails to prevent the worst injustices, and would create systems that would promote the greatest justices for the most, so that we can create a society that eventually makes equitable decisions on its own without needing those guardrails, without needing those platforms. So yeah, I think Rawls definitely thinks that there's a possibility for progress towards justice through the state.
Well, I want to go back.
Do you disagree?
No, well, part of me wants to go back to Chris. Chris has been influenced by Tim on this notion of progress to some degree. So Chris, if you're saying you don't think it's changed, all right, so how do you deal with the second part as far as expectations of government? Because part of what I see as far as a pattern, especially in more modern American society, we go from a laissez-faire late 19th century view of government to therefore a progressive view of government, followed once again by a more laissez-faire, does it have to do with the human condition, then followed again by a massive progressive, the New Deal, there, which is finally pushed back with the Reagan Revolution. So I guess my question to you, Chris, is if indeed there's been, generally there's been no progress in the human condition, would there still be changes in the expectation of government?
I think clearly, because it goes back to my point I was making about when we were on that dichotomy of Hobbes and Locke, and I mentioned the pendulum swings. I think the pendulum swings depending on the time frame. So in essence, when you say the human condition, what does that mean, the human condition? Define that for me, because I don't know what that means. Because you talk about people living in poverty. Are you talking about people have access to healthcare? Are you talking about people have access to education? Are you talking about back to life expectancy? So what is the human condition?
Yeah, I think if you give it a utilitarian frame like that, which to me is really the only way that makes sense, the answer to the question becomes kind of obvious, that yes, right? As there are fewer starving people in the world, as there are fewer impoverished people in the world, of course, expectations of what the state's role with respect to those individuals it becomes different. And maybe not necessarily in the way folks might, maybe not in the mode or by the causally in the way one might expect, but as folks become less impoverished, as they become more educated, they tend to become more autonomous, and they tend to want to do things for themselves, and not have the state intervene. And so or get in the way or hold any sort of potential for withdrawing a benefit over their head, because it makes it more difficult. Yeah, go ahead.
Let's put it in the context that our students may be able to understand, and that is, what about the fight over minimum wage right now? Let's take something concrete for our students to try and argue about, and that's the why, if we've made progress, if we're progressing, why doesn't the minimum wage go up, and why do we rely on the government to do that, or do we rely on the private sector like Costco to say, hey, we're going to do this? I don't know, I'm thinking about concrete ideas in terms of progress, and we're still saying the government comes in, the entity that is, providing the at least the floor for us, and it says it's still a 725. And why do so many people fight to raise that, while so many people are fighting against raising it, while so many people are fighting to raise it?
Okay,
Well, go ahead, Mike.
I think I can answer that. I'm gonna have to get to it. Like, progress is not in this question. Like, how has the human condition changed, and how has that change reflected? So progress, it's an interesting idea, but I don't know how to measure that. So when I read this question, I think human beings have been living together for tens of thousands of years, right? It's only been in the last 450 that we've had a state system. It's only been for the last 200 that we've had nations and not tribes. And it's only been for the last, 60 or 70 that this thing called democracy is a norm that we kind of like, everyone knows how to talk about it. So has the human condition changed? Yeah, we're way more connected. Diseases spread, people can travel. I can no longer make a living. This is where the minimum wage comes in. I can no longer get around in this world by just planting stuff in my backyard and getting by. I have to get a job. And then by getting a job, I'm kind of now entering this whole system where I don't have as much control over my life. So as those conditions change, do our expectations of government change? You bet they do, because we're no longer in groups of 20 or 100 or 200 people. We are a country of 300 plus million with a pandemic flying around, and the government is the entity that is there to sort of protect us. So we are like a blip on the radar of human existence. And to ask how the human condition has changed and expectations of government, I mean, to me, it is kind of obvious. It has changed a lot, and we expect more, because the problems, as we get to the problems later, we are dealing with inherently collective issues: climate change, nuclear warfare, starvation, inequities. These are collective issues that now we have to turn to government to solve. So.
Well, and again, I'm with Chris, is trying to get some meat on the bone here for our students. And, Chris's notion of poverty. Well, Chris, back in the 1880s, my view of the human condition is the human condition was much worse than the human condition is today. Do we still have poverty today? Absolutely. All right. But not nearly to the degree. All right. And again, let's assume that the conditions are even close to being equal. The view of government in the 1880s is very different than the view or expectations of government today. And so the question is, what causes that change? Is it just ideological? There's just, there's an ebb and flow to ideological views, or is there some connective tissue between this is what I expect of my government because these conditions exist?
Well, I think to somebody's point earlier, property still may be a driving factor in this expectation, whether it's in the form of a minimum wage, or whether it's in the form of my literal piece of turf that I live on, or whether it's my portfolio. I mean, I think the broader understanding we have of property, I think broadens our expectations of government to protect that property. And then if you were a Hobbesian, my life factors into that as well. So I think property still, I guess I'm pushing back on Mike originally, who took a kind of a disparaging view of Locke's overemphasis on property, but I think it may still be fairly prominent.
Well, I think there's a thread, and I have to admit, I was just kind of trying to read up on Hobbes, and I think right before the quote about solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, he's kind of laying out really a sense of, I don't want to say capitalism in a way, but it's about the idea that these things can't happen while this system is in place, this war of every man against every man.
Markets can't form.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't exchange goods. You can't,
right.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about this, and I'm going back to my favorite part in Fed 10, according to Madison, that governments exist to protect the different faculties in men from which property arise. And then I go forward, and David just said something, makes me think of my boy Andrew Carnegie and his essay on wealth, the justification for, because it's better that what's happening now because of this accumulation of wealth in the late 1800s, it's better for some people to have it than nobody to have it. And plus we know that this is going to lift everybody up, because what people used to have now, he's talked about the increase in standard of living and his justification for the concentration of wealth. So there's a thread in all these thoughts, and I'm just really telling, I'm just supporting you because it is about property, I think, or protecting our little turf, whatever it may be.
But Tim, would you agree that, Locke's version of property is that everyone should get the fruits of their labor, right? So to get So to get to Chris's point, we've reinterpreted Locke in a certain way to fit our own sort of power structures, because to Chris's point, the value of this, right, is huge to me. But the people who help put this together are not getting the same value for their labor to put it together, right? The capitalist system sort of uses Locke, but then kind of uses him in a certain way to justify.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Well,
Mike, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
And I think Neil will appreciate this. Do men die for pearls because they're expensive and they cost a lot? Or are pearls expensive because men die for them?
Ooh, grasshopper, take that one.
Oh, so I'm channeling a little our brother Carl.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's because they're scarce.
They're scarce.
It's hard to get.
Well, that can't explain it all, right? Lots of things are scarce that aren't valuable. It has to do with the aesthetic quality of the pearl, right? There are many things that come to bear on that, but if we want to distill it down, my answer is the latter, right? That it's valuable because whatever those aesthetic qualities are of the object, they compel people, or impel people at least, to make certain decisions that may be otherwise low utility decisions if you strip away those aesthetic values, right? The usefulness of gold or diamonds or pearl is very, 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 very ridiculously low if you don't build in a sort of cultural situatedness to the object, right? And so I think that helps sort of support the labor theory of value, personally. But you may disagree. I want to just not push back, but just maybe just highlight that folks raised and educated and speaking in the patois of a advanced or late stage capitalist.
Whoa! You gotta translate that, Neil.
Speaking the lingo, right? Using the language of an advanced or late stage capitalist society won't necessarily have a way to talk about things in any way that isn't with reference to property or with reference to material wealth or material well-being. Purely in the same sense that a Skinnerian behaviorist in psychology wouldn't be able to talk about things like beliefs because their paradigm for explaining the world revolves around the non-existence. It doesn't allow for contemplating it, which is why, I spend a lot of time online, probably more time online than I should, but online with a lot of, 19 to 30-year-old Marxists and anarcho-syndicalists and people who reject that narrative about property and material well-being, and reject the narrative that it's the job of the state to secure property rights, or that anybody actually has property rights at all that don't derive from their labor. And so I'd say that there's, you're right to say that yeah, my perception as a tax attorney working for a law firm and wanting to buy a house and viewing a lot of my my social worth or my psychological worth with respect to property, I probably think about the state and the role of the state in those terms. But people living in the global South don't think about the state in those terms. They think about the state in terms of stopping, you know, the successors to the Belgian rubber industry from, you know, starting up the chopping off of hands again. And they are far more concerned with the idea of the protection of life and the protection of the possibility for equitable outcomes, and stopping other people from becoming so powerful that the state can't stop those abuses from happening, which is, you know, when we get to such a severe inequality of wealth and inequality of distribution of resources, the state's role there almost becomes superfluous, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter almost in the states when we talk about it in certain cases, right? The actions of the legislature and the actions of our government almost always do not comport with the desires of the majority of the people who are represented by the government. They comport with the people who spend money on that
oligarchy,
government.
baby, oligarchy.
So, and maybe it is true that actually does provide the highest utility outcome, but you'd have to be a utilitarian to think that then makes it right, that gives it the flavor of justice. So I just want to make sure that that's there, that there is a little bit of diversity in the way that folks can think about this, and that muddies the waters when it comes to answering the question about whether, you know, conditions change, because what conditions and where and when. And just to add one last thing, you know, capitalism as a system requires there to always be a differential in inequities in the distribution of material goods, because if there isn't, there's no flow, just like an electric current. You can't have any kind of market if you don't have the possibility of exploiting the labor of one person in order to generate excess value that you can then distribute through the system. So anyway, that was a lot, but I want to make sure that yes, property is important, but I don't think by any means we can say it represents a kind of fundamental or essential aspect of the way that people view their relationship to the government and the government's relationship to them.
So when we look at that, the first sub question, and I struggle, I've been reading it, I don't know, 100 times. Would it be legitimate to approach this from a viewpoint of negative constitutionalism versus positive constitutionalism? You know, when we look at, you know, natural rights, classical republic guiding policy changes designed to improve the condition. Is that a legitimate tact to, you know, when we, you know, do we want, you know, we want to limit government and keep it out of our private domain, out of our lives as much as possible, or we actually want government to do certain things and provide certain things? Is that an approach you would take on this first sub question, or am I being the stupid one in the group, just way off base?
No, because I think both options assume some kind of normative moral outcome. I mean, to your point, David, some people would say the moral thing is for me to be able to acquire property, natural rights, whereas maybe the other side would have a moral principle of some kind of moral connectedness between people. So I think it's not an undersimplification at all. I think both of the options provided in that question assume a normative moral outcome,
and a metric, right, to measure, yeah. Right, and right. Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, that you know, I think framing it negative positive constitutionalism is, I mean, yeah, you can you can take I hate the term classical republicanism, an early modern republicanist approach, right? And say that, well, what we really ought to be doing is developing positive policies that aim at a particular goal, that goal being informed by moral commitments, by commitments to beliefs about what is good and what is bad, right? And what is desirable and what is not desirable. And we can point the government towards that and give it power to accomplish those goals. Or we can take the tack instead that no, right? The material goods are not determinable on anything other than an individual level. And if that's the case, what we ought to do is unfetter the hands of individuals and allow them to pursue those things. But Mike's point is well taken here, that the crises of the 21st century and the problems that face folks, and not all folks, but a lot of folks in the US above a certain income level and above a certain level of wealth, are their collective problems. I mean, they face everybody, but folks who are actually maybe in a position to do something about it. They are climate change, right? They are global thermonuclear warfare. They are world-ending threats, where just letting everybody go about and do their business and hope for the best is probably not going to be very successful in approaching those problems. So when we talk about improving the conditions of all people, I mean, we're talking about stopping us from losing 10 meters in the next 10 decades of coastline around the world, right? I mean, we're talking about being able to breathe without having to pay somebody to buy air. Those are the sorts of problems we're talking about, and it's unclear that those can be solved by just letting individuals bang up against each other and hope that that produces a solution.
Sounds
Yeah.
like Adams.
Yeah.
I wonder if we're just like peeing in the ocean trying to raise the water level here, talking about this stuff in regards to, you know, whether it be, I'm looking at the question now, natural rights, classical republic, is going back to the thing that Neil talked about, and we are all aware of, is the silo mentalities that we have. I mean, when you have people that have alternative facts, or they live in I don't want to say universe, but they live in a world, you know, that they're just constantly, their viewpoint is being reinforced in the echo chamber. Is it even feasible to even talk about whether or not we're approaching things in a more classical Republican sense versus a natural rights sense? I don't know that it just doesn't seem like it's possible now. And I go back to the idea of the oligarchy, because, you know, if you look at public opinion polls, the overwhelming majority of people favor the COVID relief package. It's $1.9 trillion. It's a crazy amount of money, but the overwhelming majority, including Republicans, favor it. And yet the members of Congress are fighting it tooth and nail to the point where this is what the majority of people appear to want, but they're going to have to use reconciliation to get it through the Senate. So, I mean, this is just, I don't know, I get frustrated with stuff like this in terms of this type of question, because it's kind of pie in the sky right now in terms of where we really are as a people.
Right. Politicians don't operate on these philosophical principles or these frameworks. These are not the ways that they think about their decisions. Their decisions are generally made pragmatically, in the most morally neutral use of that term. You know, myopically short term. It's about the election cycle. And I mean, this is true for, I say politicians because I don't want to single out either party in particular on this. Nancy Pelosi is just as guilty of this as Mitch McConnell is. Now, there's a difference in degree as far as the impact of those decisions, but everybody is operating to maintain their position in government. Why? Well, some of them believe that they're the best person for the job, but most of them believe that there isn't any other job out there for them if they're not a representative. And so the idea that they're making decisions, or that they would use the principles of natural rights philosophy or early modern republicanism in their decision making, they might, from a PR perspective or from a narrative perspective, right, appeal to certain values of individualism or appeal to certain values of communitarianism, but those aren't the principles on which they're actually making the governing decisions.
Yeah, I agree with that. If I were coaching students on this part of the question, I would say, well, obviously, it's both. It's natural rights and CR, right? So And then for me, the next place I would go is like to improve the condition of all people. Well, we know a little something right now. We have a lot of socio-economic political metrics, and one political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, when he talks about development, he talks about getting to Denmark. Like, how can Zimbabwe get to Denmark? So we look at the Scandinavian countries. If you look at all the different range of metrics in terms of social trust, happiness, economics, that's where people seem to have a condition of life where they're still exercising liberty, but they're happy. So one way to go about this is like, okay, so what is happening in those places? And it's a little bit, it's definitely not, authoritarian communism. There's definitely like individual rights and natural rights philosophy, but there is a little more collectivism, or maybe a lot more collectivism than we would see in the United States. And I would challenge, like, students can make an argument. These are the conditions we think people should be living. These are the good conditions. And then we know that these are the types of governments that get you there. And if positive constitutionalism is a mechanism within that framework, then you could talk about it. But I would kind of take it that way. Or maybe you want to argue that the best place to live right now is a place like Somalia, which is a libertarian sort of example of what it looks like to live with a very little state or no state. And maybe you want to argue that's a great place to live because it's ultimate liberty to do what you want to do, right? I don't think you would want to make that argument, but I think you could.
You could. Yeah.
Years ago, there was an organization that every year produced what they called the International Misery Index.
Yes.
And every country in the world was evaluated by a rubric, and I forget what the rubric was, but students might want to look up that organization's metric that they use to. I mean, when you mentioned Denmark, Mike, it made me think of this organization, and they had a pretty decent set of criteria by which to evaluate good government. So students might want to check into that. If anybody else remembers that organization, chime in. But it was an interesting, and they made a big poster that showed the world in the differences between places like Somalia and Denmark.
I think the Economist does something like that now. I think they have something. I forget what it is, but I think maybe if they check the Economist, that maybe that might
just access to potable water. I mean, how far do you have to walk to a well? I mean, simple things like that entered into their rubric.
Mike, you sound like Cicero there for a minute. I thought you were like channeling Cicero and the idea of let's get happy. The role of government is to make everybody happy.
Well, in Bhutan, that's what it's all about. Students should look up gross domestic happiness, the country of Bhutan. That is, they no longer track GDP; they track gross national or gross domestic happiness. So,
GDH.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm with Chris on this. I'll be honest. And we've talked about this, about the changing nature to some degree of the questions coming out of the center, and much more public policy focused. So, Chris and Tim, since you guys have vast experience both coaching this and then judging this, what advice would you give to kids with this last part? And before that, I'm just curious, as if you were judging, how do you assess this part of the question? By what criteria, finger in the wind kind of thing? 'Cause I look at the rubric that the kids are going to be assessed on, and I'm thinking, okay, what's the constitutional application here? How do they fit that in to a discussion on public policy to address climate change? I mean, I'm sure you can. It's just, kind of thing. So I'm just curious on what you would advise students as they approach this last part. To start with Chris and Tim.
On the domestic side, I think they should camp out on making arguments based in general welfare clause, those kinds of provisions within the powers of Congress that seem to be much more communitarian in orientation. Now, on a global scale, I mean, that's a Mike question, but it seemed to me you're kind of stuck with international agreements at that point as the basis of your argument.
Chris?
I would agree with Tim. I would maybe, and I know we don't use the preamble much in terms of law, but I like the idea, and I know John Kaminsky's talked about this, and I teach it this way, that the preamble is a set of promises, and what follows is a government that we create to try and carry out these promises. Sometimes we fulfill them, and sometimes we don't, and sometimes they come in conflict with each other, just in the natural scheme of things. And so I would try and couch my arguments in terms of the promises made in the preamble, which goes back to the general, which includes a general welfare clause,
Right.
promoting the general welfare, establishing justice, providing for the common defense, domestic tranquility, all those things. I think which are broader concepts written by Morris when he writes a preamble. But I think if you think about what's the role of government, what is the role of government? Step it from that way, and I think it's it's so wide open, and I'm glad I'm not judging it.
I think for the domestic part of it, I had down as one of the problems I just put self-governance. I think there's an opportunity there to think about domestically the faith or lack of faith in the democratic system, and then what policies. I mean, this is where you can kind of dive into like, oh, we should get rid of the electoral college, or there should be proportional representation. I mean, you could kind of constitutionally apply it there in terms of thinking about if you argue domestically, a problem is our faith in democracy itself, and then how to tinker. And to your point with the global, sorry, Chris, I think that's really interesting. And it's an opportunity to think about the power of the executive, right? And what it means for the United States to sign a Paris peace treaty.
Right.
And then to have one president say they're in, one president say they're out. And you could bring in that constitutional analysis just about the power of the executive and the lack of using formal treaty power or whatever. There's ways that the students could do that would be kind of cool.
They could do that with DACA as well, because if you think about the DACA recipients, they're in, they're out, they're in, they're out. I mean, it's been back and forth. And I'm thinking, Mike, listening to you, I was thinking about the just passed by the House, right? The HR 1, House Resolution 1 about securing voting rights and moving the democracy forward this way. And yet where we've seen a plethora of activity at the state level to limit access to the polls. I think therein lies a great issue for kids to wrestle with. We had the national government coming in and saying, okay, get rid of gerrymandering, access to the polls, all the stuff within HR 1. And then you look at like the states of Georgia or Arizona, or the case that's going to be heard tomorrow. I mean, the case that's going to be heard tomorrow by the court on voting rights out of Arizona. So I think that might be certainly something the kids could wrestle with in terms of that.
I heard this morning on the radio that this watchdog, I'm forgetting the name of the group, who's actually keeping track of the number of bills at state and local levels that are limiting voting rights. It's up to like 160.
I'd read a different number, but it's up there. Yeah, over 200. But yeah, it's up there.
33 states.
33 states.
Neil, what's your take on this broadly?
I mean, I view the most pressing domestic issue to be that epistemic balkanization that I talked about, even beyond wealth inequality, which obviously the concentration of wealth is a cause of the epistemic balkanization, because you have individuals with the ability to control entire narratives for entire populations and have a death grip over what news they see and what information they gather. And if you have complicit individuals willing to take a paycheck to lie to people, which we know that those folks have always existed and probably will always exist, charlatans, et cetera, you have a hard time solving any domestic issues when you can't get people to agree that something is a problem or that it even exists, or if it exists, it's not actually a good thing, right? Those who might argue that every country should become Somalia. And that's the most pressing domestic issue. And I don't know that there is a coherent constitutional argument on how to deal with that, because I can think of some solutions. I can think of some ways to solve that problem today. but they're neither moral nor just nor legal. In at least in a myopic.
Are we back
sort
to
of,
Hobbes? Are we back to Hobbes?
We're back to
well, no, we're back to Machiavelli, I think, at this point, or Aurelius, maybe a little bit there. It's there are ways to deal with it, but they don't really comport with our constitutional ideals, especially about freedom of speech and expression and freedom of association. So it's hard. I think that there are ways to set the stage, but ultimately the responsibility lies with individuals and lies with the systems in which those individuals exist and act to hold dear to certain principles of rationality, of truth, of a commitment to an evidence-based understanding of the world, a commitment to autonomy, etc. So go ahead, guys.
Well, I was going to say, well, we'll find out if this is the case in the next election in Texas.
No, absolutely, we will, and we'll see whether or not Abbott stays in office. We'll see whether real world consequences of a certain philosophy actually change people's minds as how to, you know.
I mean, to Neil's point about us being so, I'm going to use a big word too, bifurcated in our media consumption. I've read a lot in the last 10 years, and maybe it's just the Washington Post and New York Times patting themselves on the back, but they're making the argument that their subscription rates are just rising, and there's this desire for a common set of information.
Narrative.
I mean, I've often thought that dinosaurs always roar the loudest right before they die. So I wonder whether the Times and the Post are onto something here, that at some point, have we gone past a point where people are giving up on this balkanization of information, and the rise in their subscriptions are indicative of that? I mean, how do you respond to that, Neil?
I mean, I don't think there would ever have been a point in history where if you told somebody, hey, the world that you believe in is a lie, and here I can prove it, don't you want to get the real information, that people wouldn't have said, yeah, absolutely. It's a question of whether they believe you, right? And that itself is driven by certain psychological evaluations. I mean, the rise of Q is people saying, hey, I've been lied to. Here's the truth. Here's where I can find it. That's what they're looking for. People are always looking for that where is the keystone to reality? I know that I can be lied to. I know that I can be deceived, but here's this source of truth, right? I think then there's a religious element to that as well as just a bare epistemic element to it. And so I think it's absolutely correct that people look for that. But there are schisms, right? That's a word that I think people know, right? There are schisms in the value commitments of the population in the US. I think the US is maybe the worst, I don't know, example of this now. It's not the only example historically, but when you get this kind of, and here's another big word, incommensurability between two positions where you only talk past each other, right? You can't ever meet in the middle. There is no possibility of a meeting of the minds between two interlocutors. Your only options are war to the eradication of one or the other, or separation, right? And just a removal of the two tribes and into their own little epistemic bubbles where they aren't required to cooperate with each other. I don't know that there is a third way other than, some of the folks who are wrong unlearn that wrongness. And that's hard for egotistical reasons, psychological, economic, social, spiritual reasons. There's a lot of friction in moving away from one set of beliefs into another, just in general.
I agree with all that. I also think that there is like a public policy origin to this. There could be a public policy response. Like, we lost our dear friend Rush Limbaugh a couple weeks ago, and Rush's career took off with the scrapping of the fair use clause, right, of that regulation. So, I mean, there is the challenge. One of the challenges for elected officials the next decade is going to be, how do we regulate the internet? How do we regulate this information? We've done it before with new technologies when it was radio, right? We came up with these doctrines to make sure that these technologies were being used to advance democracy and to advance those morals and ideas that we know we must have for a democracy to flourish. And so I don't think it would solve the problem, because I think you're right, Neil, people are always going to find outlets for what they want to believe in. But I think there is a public policy response that could help to at least dampen kind of what we've seen the last couple of decades.
Well, we know, I mean, again, there's no doubt that there's a public policy out there, Mike, to probably address every problem we could come up with in our laundry list of domestic and global problems. The challenge seems to be, and I go back to something Chris said a little bit ago, about the preamble. Well, the preamble's like, much of human writing, especially in the philosophical bent or designing constructs, there's implicit contradictions. When you talk about the preamble kind of being this, this, what was the phrase you used?
A set of promises.
A set of promises. Well, it promises contradicting things. How can you both promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty? You can't do both of those things. And therefore that's what frames our problems when it comes to public policy is, and again, we're seeing it in the damn pandemic. I mean, my God, how hard was it to put on a mask? Yet you had millions of people frame it in a libertarian, construct of that infringes upon my liberty. I have a right not to do that, which you could argue emanates from the promise of securing the blessings of liberty. And to me, that's one of our challenges. We've talked about it before, the vagueness and open-ended nature of our Constitution. It gives us the freedom to solve it each generation, but it also doesn't, give us much guidance on how we're going to do that, except to rely upon the paradigm of the time. There. Sorry, I don't know if that's a rant, but kind of.
Yeah.
Well, David, if it makes you feel any better, when I talk about the promises, I do talk about them coming into conflict with each other. That they do. I mean, there's that natural tension, and it's really much kind of like that book on democracy. What's the author's name, Mike?
Astra Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, she talks about that natural tension, right? And the book, she talks about that natural tension between democracy and
here it comes. Here it comes. Here it comes. There it is.
I mean, she talks about that very thing, David. So I'm just saying that yes. I know one thing for sure, that my score in Scrabble is going to go way up after tonight. My Scrabble score is going to be rocking.
Well,
I don't know, man. I'm having a hard time figuring out what the first letter in some of those words are. I don't even know where to look them up.
I'm going to go to the.
I'll send a vocabulary list. All right.
I'm going to go to the transcript. I'm going to go to the transcript when we're done.
That's supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And by the way, I will instruct our editor to put in these vocab words in our source section. There.
Your editor's going to be busy.
Fantastic, Neil. This has been great.
Awesome.
Oh, so thanks. So, okay, but I actually want to give a point on that last bit, right, on the preamble, because, and this is something I said before, you can secure something by putting a man with a gun outside of it and wrapping it in chains. You can secure something by putting it on rails, or you can secure something by setting up the conditions for that thing to emerge. And you don't have to push it. You don't have to hold a gun to its head. People develop and learn values and absorb a culture and an orthodoxy about how the world works where they make those choices for themselves. And they aren't unfree choices, because if those are unfree choices, then there's no such thing as any free choice, right? Choices are always made within a situation and within a certain set of values. So the way that we can secure things often isn't by having a law that directs them and gives power, or a law that prevents something, but merely by establishing the material conditions for that behavior to be more likely than not to arise. And then it's just probability. Then it's just the stochastic, oh, damn it. I was trying really hard not to use the random nature of the world, right, in the universe as far as what outcomes come. So anyway, all right, I'm done.
Here's
Fantastic. That was your last one.
Here's a visual for the students and what Neil was just talking about. You can hold things like this really tightly. There's the man with the chains and the gun, or you can hold things like this.
Right.
It's a physics problem.
Well, with that, we have come to the end of this session, students and teachers. When we meet again, we're going to be talking on Unit 1, Question 1. Going to be looking at the American Revolution and the idea of revolutionary ideas there. We want to thank Professor Richmond for joining us and giving us some insights into Thomas Hobbes, which my conclusion is the man was full of BS, and really we should stop studying.
He let us have an interesting conversation today, so we can't eradicate him completely, right? But for him, we wouldn't be here.
All right. Same bad time, same bad place, students and teachers. Thank you very much. We'll see you later. Peace, love, yogurt, tacos.